His name was erased from the town's records, but the dead, remember Eliza Dunn, hadn't meant to linger in the attic. The stairs were steep, the air stale, and the dust clung to her dress like regret. She'd gone up looking for her grandmother's old hymnals, but found something else, a school ledger dated spring of 1856, its cover cracked and curled by time. She ran her fingers over the names of children long buried or forgotten. But one entry caught her breath, a name written in bold, practiced hand, and then erased, not crossed out. Erased, smudged violently, as if someone had tried to grind it from the very fibers of the page. Jonah Creed. No last name like that lived in town anymore. And the way it had been removed, Eliza could feel it in her bones. This wasn't just correction, it was erasure. She took the ledger downstairs. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. Some things, child, are buried for a reason. But Eliza never did like being told what not to remember. Outside, the late spring sun did little to warm the hard ground of Gallows Ridge, the oldest part of town where nobody dared build anything new. Past the sagging fence and overgrown graves, one plot sat bare, just soil, no stone. Eliza paused before it. A fresh bundle of wild sage lay atop the earth. Someone had been there recently. A voice rasped behind her. "Graves talk, Miss Dunn. You just got to know how to listen." She turned to see Silas Maddox, the cemetery caretaker. His coat was too big, and his hat smelled of whiskey and mildew, but his eyes were sharp, almost lucid, like the kind of mad that sees truth others won't. I was just looking," she said. "There's no name here." Silas tilted his head. "That's the point. Used to be. Got pulled up, chipped off and tossed in the river, they say. But the dead don't care much for silence. They remember." "Ooh, who was buried here?" He scratched his chin, squinting into the past. "Jonah Creed," he muttered. "Marshall, before the town got soft, before they chose comfort over justice." The wind stirred. Eliza shivered. "Marshall?" she asked. "Why would a marshal be erased?" Silas chuckled, dry and bitter. "Because the town didn't want to remember what it did to him, what it let happen. So they buried his name like they buried his body. But bones don't lie, Miss Dunn, and neither do ghosts." And that night Eliza couldn't sleep. She lit the oil lamp in her study and spread the old schoolbook across her desk. Jonah Creed. The name felt wrong on her tongue, like a truth she hadn't earned the right to speak. She flipped through the ledger again. One line read, "Creed expelled." Then a note, "Conduct unbecoming, removed." Nothing more. She searched the town archives the next day. Nothing. No record of a Marshall Creed. No mention of a Jonah. Not in census books, not in court logs, not even in the obituaries. It was as if he had never existed, except for that grave. And the sage, someone kept leaving. 2 days later, she returned to Gallows Ridge at dawn, notebook in hand. The bundle of sage was fresh again. She crouched and placed a finger against the soil, damp, not from rain. Someone had cried here. "Miss Dunn!" The voice made her jump. This time it was Reverend Acker, stooped and solemn, walking with a cane. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. "Why not?" "Because this grave holds a truth that tore this town in two. A truth we decided not to remember." She stood. "You mean you chose to forget?" He didn't answer. Instead, he touched the brim of his hat and turned to leave. But just before he disappeared beyond the rusted gate, he said, without turning back, "Some names don't fade with time, Eliza. Some bleed through the soil." That evening, as the sun bled over the plains and the town bells rang 6, a shadow stepped down from a train that shouldn't have stopped. The engine groaned and hissed, but no one got off. No one saw the figure walking west past the chapel, past the schoolhouse, up toward Gallows Ridge, except Silas, who watched from the shadows, eyes wide. He whispered to no one, "He's back." And somewhere beneath the soil, the wind whispered a name that refused to stay buried, Jonah Creed. The town of Wickfield rose late and slept early. It had the look of a place that had once known fire and now feared sparks. At the edge of it, where the chapel cast long shadows over the dead, Eliza walked with her coat pulled tight, notebook clutched in one hand, a lantern in the other. She returned to the nameless grave just after sunrise. The sage was gone. In its place, 5 small stones arranged in a perfect line, each with a single carved letter, J, C, R, D, M. Eliza knelt and traced them, her brow furrowing. "Miss Dunn," came the familiar rasp. Silas stood behind her, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "Who placed these?" she asked, standing. Silas glanced toward the church, then the ground. "Not I, but I know what they mean." He pointed with a crooked finger. "J for Jonah, C for Creed, R, Ruth, D, Daniel, M." He paused. "Is their children?" "Micah," she asked. Silas shook his head slowly. "No, they're victims." Later that day, Eliza climbed the hill behind the schoolhouse where the old Calder Ranch once stood. What was left had rotted into the earth, but inside the last remaining barn, under rusted horseshoes and the smell of long-dead hay, she found a trunk covered in burlap. Inside, a marshal's badge, scorched at the edge, a silver locket with initials worn away, and a folded letter yellowed and stiff. "To whoever dares remember, they made me kill what I loved. I disobeyed, they buried truth with bodies. But the ground will rise. Someday someone will hear. And if you find this, know I was not the villain. J.C." That night, Eliza brought the letter to Tess Calder, her great-aunt, and one of the last women alive who remembered the old town. Tess hadn't left her porch in 10 years, but her eyes were sharp behind the veil of age. "Eliza," she rasped, "do you know what you're digging up?" "Truth," Eliza answered. Tess chuckled bitterly. "No, girl, you're digging up ghosts, and ghosts don't stay still when disturbed." She poured a finger of whiskey into her tea, sipped, and stared off into the dusk. "Your grandfather, Henry Dunn, he was deputy to Marshal Creed. Loyal at first. But when the town turned on Jonah, Henry turned faster." Eliza blinked. "Turned on him? For what?" Tess didn't speak. She rose instead and hobbled inside, returning with a wooden box. Inside were newspaper clippings scorched at the corners, a photograph of 5 men standing stiff in front of the courthouse, and a half-burned wanted poster. Jonah's face, young, stern, eyes full of resolve, stared back. Wanted for murder. The next morning, Eliza approached the one man no one trusted but everyone tolerated, Micah Ford. He owned half the land west of the river and all of the fear inside it. He stood on his porch, cleaning a double barrel. "Eliza Dunn," he grunted. "Come for a history lesson." "I came to ask about Jonah Creed." The cleaning cloth paused. "He's dead." "Then why is someone leaving stones and letters on his grave?" He looked up sharply. "You've been digging where you shouldn't, girl." "I'm not digging. I'm remembering." Micah set the cloth down. "There's a difference between remembrance and resurrection. You keep chasing his name, you might find why we buried it." That afternoon, at the edge of the cemetery, a boy ran to Silas with eyes wide and a shaking voice. "There's writing on the chapel wall," he said, "in red." Silas followed, and there it was. He was not the villain, painted in letters crude but large, running across the stone in a color too dark to be paint. Eliza arrived minutes later. Silas said nothing, only nodded once toward the words. "It's starting," he whispered. In the saloon that evening, whispers began to crawl between whiskey glasses and smoke. They say Jonah Creed was framed, that he tried to stop what happened on Dry Hollow Ridge, but they silenced him instead. They say Reverend Acker saw it all. They say ghosts walk. At midnight, Eliza lit a lantern and returned to the grave. The 5 stones had been replaced. Now they formed a name, Creed, and next to them, in the dirt, someone had drawn the outline of a star, a marshal's badge. She stared, heart pounding. Behind her the wind shifted, and for the first time she heard it. Footsteps, not in the grass, beneath the earth. The wind in Gallows Ridge was different that morning, colder, heavier. as if it carried a warning only the guilty could hear. Eliza stood alone before the nameless grave. The stones spelling creed were still there, but something else caught her attention. Fresh soil. A patch near the head of the grave had been disturbed, not by animals, not by wind, by hands, human ones. She turned sharply. No one. But her gut told her this wasn't over. It was just beginning. She found Silas crouched in the far corner of the cemetery, muttering over a broken stone. "I heard them again last night," he whispered as she approached. Not words, sounds, scratching, moaning, like the dead remembering how to speak. She didn't flinch, not anymore. "Who dug up the soil?" she asked. Silas tilted his head, thoughtful. "Sometimes the earth rises on its own when it can't keep secrets any longer." She crouched beside him. "Silas, what happened on Dry Hollow Ridge?" He looked at her then, really looked. His eyes no longer clouded by whiskey or madness, just age and fear. "They told the town it was a shootout," he said. "A dispute over land between cattlemen and settlers. But that was a lie." Eliza's hands tightened into fists. Silas continued, voice low, as if the trees were listening. "They were a group of poor families, homesteaders from the east, built cabins out there, lived quiet, but Royce Bellamy and his men, they didn't want them settling where the railroad was headed." Eliza's breath caught. "Jonah tried to stop it, tried to warn them. He rode out alone, stood between 20 rifles and those people." Silas shook his head. "Only one man rode back, and when he got back, they said he did it." Eliza's stomach churned. She turned toward the chapel, where Reverend Acker was lighting candles at the altar. She waited until the chapel emptied before stepping inside. "I need you to tell me what happened," she said. He didn't look up. "Some truths don't cleanse the soul, Miss Dunn. They scorch it." "You were there," he sighed. "Yes." She stepped closer. "Did Jonah Creed kill those people?" Acker's voice was barely a whisper. "No, but he buried them." That afternoon, Eliza and Silas rode to Dry Hollow Ridge. The land was empty now, except for the ruins of cabins, their foundations half swallowed by grass and time. But Silas guided her to a grove of dead trees. There the earth was uneven, mounded in places, sunken in others. Mass graves. He handed her a rusted shovel. "Only if you're ready." They dug in silence. Eliza's hands blistered. Her breath turned ragged, and just as the sun began to fall behind the hills, bone, a child's ribcage, tiny, fragile. Then more, a boot, a rusted button. A bullet still lodged in vertebrae. She collapsed beside the hole, trembling. Silas sat beside her, wiping dirt from his face. "They lined them up, Eliza. Shot them where they stood. Told the town they fought back." "Who pulled the trigger?" Silas didn't answer. He didn't need to. She already knew. That night she returned home and opened her grandfather's locked chest. Inside, a badge, a photo of him and Jonah, and a letter sealed in wax. She read it, her breath quickening. "I never believed the lie, not truly. But I was a coward, and cowards don't get to speak when brave men die. If you're reading this, Eliza, then the truth has clawed its way back, and I deserve to be haunted." Outside in the shadows of Wickfield, a figure watched from the tree line. Long coat, wide-brimmed hat, a rifle slung across his back. His face was worn, jaw dusted with grey stubble. His eyes were fixed on the church steeple. He hadn't stepped foot in this town for 15 years. Not since the day they stripped him of his badge and tried to hang him without a trial. Not since they buried his name with the bodies he couldn't save. But now the wind was stirring, and the bones were rising. Jonah Creed had come home. The first to see him was the station master's boy. He swore later that a man stepped off the westbound train after midnight, even though it wasn't scheduled to stop. No one saw him buy a ticket. No one remembered him boarding. All the boy could say was, he walked off like the train owed him a favor. At dawn, Sheriff Royce Bellamy sat on his porch, polishing his revolver with slow, deliberate care. His fingers were steady, but his jaw had been clenched since he received a note slipped under his door the night before. It bore no signature, only 3 words scrawled in old ink. I remember everything. In the town square, folk whispered of hoofprints found behind the chapel, deep, wide set, too clean for any of the town's current riders. Someone had seen a man riding through the fog before sunrise, stopping by the cemetery, standing over a nameless grave for a long, long time. When the morning bells rang, the townspeople gathered as usual, but their conversations were quiet, distracted, tense. Then someone gasped. There, nailed to the old courthouse doors, was a marshal's badge, scorched at the edge, impaled through a wanted poster so old and faded it shouldn't have still existed. Jonah Creed's face stared back at them. Someone screamed. Eliza ran to the courthouse, elbowing through the crowd. She stared at the badge, at the paper curling from age and weather. And then she saw what had been written over Jonah's printed name in red ink. Framed by the law. Buried by fear. She turned to Sheriff Bellamy, who had arrived moments after. Their eyes met. His were cold. "You playing games, Miss Dunn?" he growled. "I think you know who is," she replied. That evening, every lamp in town seemed to flicker. Silas Maddox, watching from his shack near the edge of Gallows Ridge, sat unmoving in his chair, whispering to the wind. "He's walking again," he said. "And he's starting with the liars." He took a sip from his flask, then dumped the rest onto the dirt. "No more forgetting," he muttered. "The ground won't let me." By nightfall, it was Micah Ford's ranch that felt the shift. His dogs, usually violent and alert, were whimpering under the porch. His hired men spoke of seeing a dark figure standing beyond the tree line for hours, never moving. Then they found a cross, hand-carved, staked into Micah's front field. On it was etched a name, Ruth Creed. Micah tore it down with trembling hands, but he didn't sleep that night. Because just before sunrise, someone rang the old iron triangle that once called the town to arms. Only 3 people knew where it was buried. Jonah Creed had been one of them. The next morning, Reverend Acker stepped onto his pulpit and found a bundle of sage tied with black thread on the altar, a sign of mourning, but also a warning. He froze. From the back pew, Jonah sat in silence, hat pulled low, coat dusty, boots worn but polished. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But the Reverend recognized him instantly, and his voice cracked as he tried to begin the sermon. Word spread. "Jonah Creed is alive. No, it's a ghost. Didn't he die in the Ridge Massacre? They tried to kill him. He's back to finish what they started." Fear became a fog in Wickfield. Doors were bolted before dusk. Guns were cleaned. Men who once laughed in saloons now drank with their backs to the wall. But Eliza wasn't afraid. She waited outside the chapel until the congregation had gone. Jonah emerged as the sun fell behind the hills. He didn't speak, just looked at her. The lines of his face carved deeper than the photograph she'd seen. The grey in his beard was new, but the fire in his eyes was not. "I believe you," she said softly. He nodded once, then turned toward the cemetery. As he walked, townspeople peeked from windows. Some swore they saw shadows following him, old shapes, familiar outlines. Silas, sitting in the dark, heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't beneath the earth, they were above it, coming for those who had forgotten what they buried. And in Sheriff Bellamy's office, the lantern dimmed suddenly. The air went cold. On his desk lay a second note, though no one had entered. This time, it read, "You buried the wrong man." Eliza hadn't slept in 2 nights. Not since Jonah's return. Not since the badge was nailed to the courthouse door. She sat on the floor of her grandmother's attic again, surrounded by dust and silence, opening every box she hadn't dared touch before. Her hands were blistered, her eyes dry. At the bottom of a chest wrapped in oilcloth she found it, a stack of letters bound in twine, their corners brittle, each one signed J.C. The first letter was dated March 2nd, 1856, 5 days before the massacre. "Deputy Dunn, they mean to clear the ridge, not by law, but by fire and bullet. I've begged Bellamy to stop it, but he wants the land. The railroad men offered him more than this town ever could. He says we can make history if we let it happen. But history built on ash and blood won't stand. I'm riding out at dawn. I'll stand between them if I have to. You were once a man of conscience. Be that man again. Marshal Jonah Creed. Eliza's breath shook. She read every letter, 10 in all, each more desperate, more furious, more heartbroken than the last. The final one, never sent, was sealed but unaddressed. Inside, if I fall, I want my name remembered, not for glory, not for justice, but for the children buried with no crosses, for the mothers who screamed and weren't heard. Let me not be the last voice for them. That same evening, Jonah returned to the graveyard. He didn't speak to Silas, who watched him from the shadows, whispering prayers to the earth. Jonah knelt at the nameless grave. Eliza approached slowly, the letters in her satchel, her breath caught between apology and awe. I read them, she said. Jonah looked up. She offered the bundle. They tried to burn your name, she whispered, but your words, they survived. He took the letters without a word, held them to his chest and closed his eyes. It was the first time she saw something human behind the fury, grief. Meanwhile, in the sheriff's office, Royce Bellamy stared at his wall of commendations. Old photographs of himself with governors, lawmen, and town elders. He picked up the burned marshal's badge from his desk and turned it in his hand like a curse. Micah Ford barged in. You said he was dead. Bellamy didn't flinch. He was. Then explain the cross, the letters, the damn footsteps at my door. Bellamy rose slowly. We finish it. This time, no trial, no second chances. Micah sneered. You want to kill a ghost. I want to bury him deeper. Eliza spent the next day with Reverend Acker, forcing answers from the man who had once hidden behind sermons. I read the burial records, she told him. They list names, Ruth Calder, Daniel Miller, 4 children, 2 infants, but no causes of death, no graves. Reverend Acker wiped his brow. I was told to mark them as relocated. I did what I was told. By Bellamy. He nodded, ashamed. Eliza stepped closer. If you knew the truth and let the lie live, then you didn't just bury Jonah's name. You buried the whole town's soul with it. He wept silently. I was a coward. That night, as the wind howled and windows rattled, Eliza returned to the schoolhouse. She tore down the blackboard, uncovering a hidden cavity. Inside, an old satchel with Jonah's field journal. Names, witness accounts, sketches of the ridge before the massacre. A final page, if you find this, know I died trying to save them. And if I live, may the living remember. She closed the book with trembling hands. Outside, the bell above the church rang once. No one was there, and yet everyone heard it. The next morning, a line of white crosses appeared overnight along the road to Dry Hollow Ridge. Each one marked with a name, each one freshly carved. The town awoke in silence. Sheriff Bellamy didn't leave his house that day, but Jonah did. He walked past the saloon, past the old jailhouse, past the whispers that followed him like smoke. He said nothing, only stopped in front of the mayor's house, the same mayor who'd signed the land clearance decree in 1856. The door creaked open. Inside, the mayor sat, trembling. Jonah didn't raise his gun. He simply dropped a bundle of sage on the floor, then walked away. The message was clear. You are being remembered. The first body was found at dawn. Deputy Harlan Sykes, one of Bellamy's men for more than 20 years, was discovered hanging from the gallows tree in the old part of town, the same tree where they once tried to hang Jonah Creed. There was no rope burn around his neck, no struggle, no marks of violence, but his eyes were wide, his mouth open, and in his left hand, clutched so tightly it had to be pried loose, was a silver button. Military issue, Union cavalry. The same kind Jonah had worn on his coat the day he vanished. By midday, panic spread through Wickfield like wildfire. Bellamy locked his doors. Micah Ford loaded every rifle he owned. The mayor boarded up his windows and sent for U.S. Marshals. None came. And still, Jonah walked the streets. No weapon drawn, no threat made. But where he passed, doors slammed, curtains twitched, and whispers filled the alleys like rats in the walls. In the saloon, a mirror shattered without reason. Behind it, carved into the wall with a blade, "We remember the Ridge." Silas Maddox, who rarely left the graveyard, sat alone at the bar, speaking softly into his empty glass. They buried them in silence. Now they speak in echoes. The bartender, pale and trembling, dared ask, "What do they want?" Silas looked up. Names. That evening, Eliza was visited by Tess Calder, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes sharp with urgency. "You need to see something," the old woman said. They walked to Tess's cellar, where dust covered everything, except for a locked trunk. Inside, a ledger of land transfers dating back 30 years. One entry caught Eliza's breath. 1856, land reclaimed from abandoned settler plots, reissued to Ford Holdings and Wickfield Development, authorized by Sheriff R. Bellamy and Deputy H. Sykes. The signature below, H. Dunn, her grandfather. Tess placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder. They killed them not just for power, but for profit. Eliza clenched the paper. "Then I'll make sure they pay, one by one." That night, Micah Ford awoke to silence. Too silent. He rose from bed, loaded his shotgun, and opened the door. No wind, no crickets, just heavy stillness. And then he saw it. Dozens of small white crosses planted along his fence line, each bearing a name. And one, larger than the rest, read, "Ruth Creed, age 9. Micah stumbled back, breath gone. In the distance, a lantern flickered, and a figure stood watching from the trees. Jonah. No gun, no horse, just his eyes. Micah fired. The shot echoed into nothing. When he looked again, Jonah was gone. In the church the next morning, Reverend Acker found something beneath the altar. A folded page from the Marshal's field book, ripped and faded. He unfolded it with shaking hands. Drawn on the page, a map of the ridge with burial sites marked in red ink. Below the drawing, in bold letters, "Let the earth speak what the law would not." He dropped to his knees. And for the first time in years, he prayed out loud, not for the living, but for the dead. Later that day, Sheriff Bellamy summoned the town council. He demanded silence, demanded obedience, promised rewards for loyalty. But no one volunteered to help. Not this time. Jonah Creed had become more than a man. He was a consequence. A reckoning. Eliza stood in the schoolhouse, chalk in hand, and wrote the names of every settler murdered at Dry Hollow Ridge across the blackboard. Then she opened the doors. Let every child read them. Let every parent see. History, she decided, would no longer be a whisper. At sunset, the bell above the church rang again, 3 times. Silas stood by the grave, his shovel in the dirt. "I didn't do it," he whispered. He looked down. A hand had broken the soil beside the grave. Bone, dirt-stained fingers. He staggered back, then laughed, not out of madness, but out of knowing. "They're not just speaking anymore," he said. "They're rising." It was the widow Calder who found the second body. Micah Ford, slumped in the dirt outside his barn, his eyes wide with terror, just like Harland Sykes. No wounds, no blood, just fear, frozen on his face like a mask. On his chest, pinned with a broken nail, lay a child's locket wrapped in soot-blackened ribbon. Inside, 2 initials carved with a shaking hand, R.C., Ruth Creed. The town didn't need a coroner to name the cause of death. It wasn't poison. It wasn't lead. It was remembrance. Sheriff Royce Bellamy watched from his office window as Micah's body was carted through the street. He didn't speak, didn't blink. He simply took out his flask, drank deeply, and muttered, "One by one." When he looked at the old portrait on the wall, himself, Jonah, and 3 other lawmen, he flinched. A new detail had appeared overnight. Across his painted throat in red chalk, someone had drawn a slash. That evening, Jonah approached the church again. Eliza was waiting. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, voice steady. He stared at her for a long moment, then handed her something. A folded court deposition, unsigned, water-stained. It read, "We were told to clear the ridge, told they had weapons, but there were no shots fired at us, just women, children, smoke and screams." At the bottom, a single name, Deputy H. Dunn, her grandfather. Eliza closed her eyes. "My blood helped bury the truth." Jonah shook his head once. "No, but you're the one digging it back up." The next day, Jonah rode out alone to the mayor's estate. No one stopped him. No one dared. He tied his horse beneath the weather vane and walked inside unannounced. The mayor, pale and sweating, stood behind a desk lined with liquor bottles and denial. "You can't threaten me," he barked. Jonah said nothing. He placed a ledger on the desk, land deeds, forged signatures and letters linking the mayor to the railroad companies. Then a photo, the ridge before the fire, and then a final paper, a list of names. The mayor's own signature was at the bottom. Jonah lit a match, set the papers ablaze, watched the man tremble, then walked away without a word. The mayor resigned the next morning and vanished. Reverend Acker, after years of silence, finally climbed the church steps at Sunday service and told the town everything. How he had seen the settlers rounded up, how he heard Bellamy's orders, how Jonah had tried to stop it, how they framed him because he knew too much and refused to be silent. "I buried the truth under prayers and candles," the reverend confessed. "But it never stayed buried." No one clapped, no one cheered, but no one walked out either. That night, Eliza returned to the ridge alone. She carried with her the last of Jonah's letters, the names of the victims, and her grandfather's confession. She built a small cairn of stones, placed the pages beneath it, lit a single lantern, then watched the shadows stretch and sway. Behind her, Jonah stood in silence. "You came," she said. "I never left," he replied. At the edge of town, Silas Maddox dug a shallow trench, not for a body, but for truth. He laid out the names carved on wood, the tokens he'd kept, lockets, buttons, pieces of cloth, and whispered, "They've spoken. You listened, now let the town see." He lit the match. The fire spread slow and wide. Smoke carried the scent of pine, ash, and something older, guilt. By morning, crosses lined the town square, handmade, uneven, dozens of them, each marked not just with names of the dead, but with truths. Shot unarmed, buried without prayer, erased from records, killed for land, witnessed, denied, forgotten, and one taller than the rest. Jonah Creed, framed, silenced, returned. Sheriff Bellamy could take no more. He marched through the center of town, with his rifle slung over his shoulder and murder in his eyes. He fired a shot into the air. "I'm still the law here," he shouted. From the church steps, Jonah appeared. No badge, no weapon, only a long, steady gaze. The crowd stepped back. Bellamy raised his rifle. Jonah didn't flinch. Eliza stepped forward, holding the marshal's field journal high. "Your law died the day you buried the truth," she said. Bellamy fired. The bullet struck the journal and dropped. Jonah still stood. Bellamy froze. The crowd didn't cheer. They turned their backs. Bellamy was gone by dawn. Some say he fled west. Others say he wandered into the ridge and never returned. But the wind carries whispers near Gallows Ridge now, and they don't whisper his name. The wind changed just after midnight. Cold and dry, it blew through the empty streets of Wickfield with a whisper like breath against the neck, soft but undeniable. A few townsfolk stirred in their beds. Dogs whined. Somewhere in the distance, the long-dead bell above the church let out one sharp clang, then another and another, 3 slow, echoing chimes, and silence. They gathered without knowing why. The shopkeeper, the schoolboy, the blacksmith and his wife. Lanterns flickered to life across porches. Doors opened. Boots crunched gravel. All eyes turned toward the church. A figure stood on the chapel steps. Jonah Creed. He was dressed not as a ghost nor a stranger, but as a man who belonged to no one and to everyone. His coat was worn but straight, his boots dusted, The marshal's badge, scorched and bent, was pinned to his chest once more. In his hand, a lantern, lit and steady. Beside him stood Reverend Acker, head bowed, his hand clutching a Bible like a lifeline. And beside them both, Eliza, holding the town's old ledger, newly rewritten with the names that had once been scrubbed out of history. The townspeople came closer, silent and tight, like mourners at the edge of a grave. Jonah spoke, not loud, but with words that struck deeper than any sermon. This place stood through war and drought, through storms and hunger, but it could not stand through truth. He raised the lantern slightly as if weighing it. They prayed here while burying the ridge, while silencing the mothers, while I sat in chains for a sin I tried to stop. The Reverend lifted his head, eyes glistening. Jonah turned to him and asked, "Are you ready?" Acker nodded. Jonah stepped forward and pushed open the chapel doors. Inside, the building had already been prepared. Silas Maddox had worked quietly through the day, laying pine branches and dry cloth beneath the pews. Oil had been poured in lines beneath the altar and along the walls. Torn ledger pages lined the nave like parchment ghosts, each with a name. Jonah walked inside. He paused at the front. The altar where he once knelt as a younger man was now cracked and hollow. He whispered something the others couldn't hear. Then he placed the lantern down at the center. A moment passed, and then flame. The fire began slow, curling up the aisle like a snake tasting the air. It licked at the pews, it clawed at the lectern, it found the pitch and roared to life. Smoke rose from the roof like a funeral wail. Outside, the town watched in stillness. The windows of the chapel shattered in bursts of color, blue, green, red, falling like rain made of shame. Each glass shard seemed to carry a scream, a plea, a forgotten name. Then, with a creaking groan, the bell tower collapsed inward, taking the rafters with it in a cloud of fire and ash. No one screamed, no one ran. They understood. This wasn't revenge, it was atonement. When the last of the flames died, only the skeleton of the church remained. 4 scorched beams stood upright, their tips forming a blackened cross. Nothing else. Jonah stood at the base, face lit by the fading embers. Eliza stepped beside him, opened the ledger, and began to read aloud. Ruth Creed, Daniel Miller, Abigail Wright, Clara and May Doyle. She read until her voice cracked. The wind carried the names through the town like prayers too long unspoken. At sunrise, Eliza hammered a plaque into the ashes where the altar had once stood. It read, "This church burned not from fire, but from memory. May those it failed speak forever." That evening, Jonah returned alone to Gallows Ridge. There, beneath the new cross that marked Ruth's grave, he knelt and placed a smooth stone. Then another, and another. He began to build, not a monument of pride, but of truth. Soon footsteps approached behind him. Eliza. She didn't speak. She knelt beside him and placed a stone of her own. Then came Silas. Then children. Then elders who once feared his name. Together they built a memorial of hands and regret. No marble, no gold, just earth and memory. Jonah stood at last. The town behind him was quiet now, cleansed in a way. "Is it done?" Eliza asked. He shook his head once. "It's remembered. That's enough." She reached into her coat and handed him something. His old journal, rebound, restored. He took it gently, held it to his chest, and then, with the weight of years finally lifting, he smiled. A small, tired smile. Then he walked into the dusk, and as he disappeared beyond the last row of stones, the wind shifted once more, carrying not screams, but names. The fire was long gone, but its warmth lingered, not in the air, but in the eyes of the town. The people of Wickfield walked slower now, not out of fear, but reverence. They looked at the schoolhouse differently. They paused before passing the ridge. They stepped softly around the new memorial at Gallows Ridge, where Ruth Creed's name marked the first stone. And in the center of it all, in the schoolhouse window, a new display stood behind the glass. The Marshal's Field Book. Eliza had spent days transcribing it by hand, not just the names and entries, but Jonah's sketches, his thoughts, his observations, his warnings. The first page read, "The law is not the badge, it's the spine behind it. And if the spine breaks, the badge means nothing." She placed the original in a sealed case, built by the carpenter whose own grandfather had once called Jonah traitor. Now he carved the words into oak. Marshal Jonah Creed, silenced by lies, remembered by truth. The children read his name every morning now. It was part of a new lesson Eliza called the Reckoning Bell. They recited the names of the fallen from Dry Hollow Ridge, each followed by a short silence. Then they read from Jonah's own words, never long, just one page, one truth. "I stood alone once. I thought that was the only way. But now I know. Memory is shared or it dies. Even the old families, those who once carried Bellamy's blood or profited from the ridge, began to come forward. A woman named Clara Voss brought in a rusted tin of her father's letters. In one, he begged for forgiveness for forging testimonies. Another man, whose uncle once rode with the clearance party, confessed publicly and knelt at the foot of the memorial. No one applauded, but no one mocked him either, because Wickfield wasn't about denial anymore. It was about facing the mirror. The church, now a scorched skeleton, remained untouched. No one rebuilt it. Instead, the townsfolk laid simple benches in a circle around the blackened beams. That became the new place of gathering. No sermons, no pulpit, just silence and names. Every week, Eliza brought a new passage from the field book. She read it aloud. The townsfolk listened, even the children, especially the children. One night, Silas Maddox stood at the edge of the ridge, lantern in hand, his hair wild, eyes wet. He murmured, "I buried truth in this town for too long, but Jonah, he planted it." He turned to Eliza, who stood beside him. "Did you know?" he said. "He used to visit the graves before dawn, talk to them, one by one." "I believe it," she whispered. Silas smiled. That's why they remembered him. Far beyond the ridge, rumors spread through passing travelers of a marshal with no town, riding from place to place, saying little, doing much. A man who stood up for the voiceless, who wrote no new laws, but made people remember the ones they'd forgotten. Some called him a ghost, others a reckoner. But in Wickfield, they knew the truth. He was a man who had been erased, but who wrote himself back in ink and blood and silence. One quiet morning, Eliza opened the field book and turned to the final page. There was no sketch, no list, only a note scrawled in a steady hand. "If they forget me, let them forget the man, but not what I stood for. Let them remember what silence costs, and let the fire remind them truth leaves smoke behind." She ran her hand across the page and closed the book. Then she walked to the schoolhouse door and opened it wide. The children filed in, laughing. And in the front of the room, above the blackboard, hung a plaque. "This room was once silent. Now it speaks." Jonah Creed would never return to Wickfield. He didn't need to, because the dead remembered him. And now, the living did too. The stone arrived 6 weeks later. No one knew who paid for it. It came on a freight wagon from the east, wrapped in burlap, heavy as guilt. The deliveryman said nothing, only handed Eliza a slip of paper and tipped his hat. The paper bore no sender. Only a sentence. "Every story deserves a name." They placed it at Gallows Ridge, where the earth had finally been made clean by remembrance. The townsfolk came in silence, gathering around the site that had once been a scar, now a sanctuary. Children carried wildflowers. Silas carved benches from fallen cedar, and at the center stood the stone, smooth, dark gray, with letters cut so deep they seemed to echo even without voice. Jonah Creed, Marshal of Wickfield, erased by fear. Remembered by the brave, Eliza stood before it, hands folded in front of her. She wore no black. This wasn't mourning, it was honor. She stepped up and opened the field book one last time. Her voice carried, He stood when no one else would. He fell alone so others could rise. He did not return for vengeance. He returned for memory. The crowd bowed their heads. Then, one by one, they spoke his name aloud. Not whispered, not hidden, spoken. That night, as the lanterns flickered out across the town, Eliza sat alone in the schoolhouse, pen in hand, writing the final lines of the ledger. Not in the town records, but in a new book, The Forgotten of Wickfield. The last page held a dedication to the ones they tried to silence, to the names they tried to erase, to the man who made sure they were remembered. May your memory be louder than fire, stronger than shame, and may the dead who remember never be alone again. Far from the town, beneath the shade of a canyon bluff, a man sat alone by a fire. His coat was dusted by road, his rifle clean, his journal open beside him. He'd written no new entries in weeks, only watched the flames. A rider passed in the distance, didn't stop. But as he disappeared over the hill, he called out, "Safe travels, Marshal Creed." Jonah didn't answer, just nodded once, slow, and smiled. Back in Wickfield, the school children carved something into a wooden sign and posted it at the edge of town. It said, "Welcome to Wickfield, the town that remembers." And beneath it, a single quote etched in iron, "Truth may be buried, but the dead remember." Jonah Creed never had a wife. He left behind no bloodline, no ranch, no fortune, but he left something more lasting. He left a ledger rewritten, a church reborn in silence, a town that learned to look itself in the eye, and a name that had once been erased, now carved in stone, forever. If this story moved you, if Jonah Creed's silence spoke louder than bullets, and his name carved in stone stirred something in your heart, take a moment to reflect on the forgotten truths in your own life. What names, what stories deserve to be remembered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read everyone. And if you believe stories like this still matter, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale that dares to speak where others stay silent.